Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. The Ukraine war has now been dragging on for 74, 75, 76, 77, 79, 80, 90, and it's a counter basically. And that's what I wanted to actually bring about by me showcasing my counting skills. It's a sad story what is actually playing out there for each and every country that is involved. For a lot of people, the West is coming out to be a winner. But if you actually look at it, the West is also suffering a huge amount of economic loss, which is being showcased by the recession in their economies and so on and so forth. Russia, of course, is taking a big hit. And what to say about Ukraine? Now, what I wanted to talk to Lieutenant General Syed Hasnain, a very relevant voice in terms of strategic affairs and analysis, especially of warfare, is what is the Western strategy for this Ukraine war? Is there any strategy? Because we've heard multiple voices from the beginning to the middle to now. Sir, thank you so much for joining me to help me understand.
Thank you very much.
Sir, now, when we look at the war, it started with some negotiations pretty fast within the first month of the war. And today, we see that the entire set of negotiations which was being done in Turkey and this and that has literally gone out. Rumors about Boris Johnson coming and telling President Zelensky that fight on, we will back you, and so on and so forth are pretty rife right now. What do you read out of this situation where allegedly the West is kind of pressuring the Ukrainians to fight on, sir?
Thank you, Aadi. First of all, let me make a point that it's very interesting that we are discussing something different to just war fighting. In our previous programs, we have discussed a lot on the operational and tactical aspects of this war. But there are much more larger issues involved here, and I think it's very important that today we have decided to discuss those. Having said that, yes, you're right. I'm also keeping a count on the number of days which are going past. And each passing day, I wonder how long can this issue continue in this manner. And I come to a conclusion that low-intensity, hybrid kind of a war, quite apart from the type of intense operations we saw in the beginning, could probably continue for fairly long. And the Western world seems to be confident with the manner in which they have been able to play out the information game in particular, and convince the rest of the world that the Russians are really on the back foot, and that they could capitulate any moment. And that is going to have a huge economic effect on the Russian economy. I'm sure we will discuss this subsequently also. And the Russia's capability to fight this war is going to be highly suspect as we go along in the next few days. Given that kind of a projection that the Western world, NATO, is doing, it is apparent that a lot of people are visiting. A lot of people are visiting Kyiv. You've seen lots of high-profile visits, including the Speaker of the U.S. Congress, Senate, and the overall the legislature. And Nancy Pelosi herself also visiting there. So the thing is being taken stock of. Obviously, Kyiv is now under reasonably diluted pressure as such, and they can focus on this kind of a diplomacy which is taking place. So, to my mind, the West and NATO seems to be reasonably confident that they can carry this whole thing through. They will be able to, through their different networks, international food networks, international fuel and energy networks, etc., be able to convince people about the willingness, the willingness, should I say, attitude of Russia and Russia's leader in particular. They will look for regime change. They will simultaneously we were talking about regime change in Ukraine first. But now is the time when we should start looking at the reverse regime change, which is the possibility of intense pressure coming on the Russian leadership itself. And despite the dictatorial methodology which Vladimir Putin follows, what could be his ultimate destiny? So these are some of the issues which are very, very interesting. And to summarize exactly what I've said, I think the West is looking for a middle to long drawn out kind of a engagement which will lead to a capitulation, not militarily necessarily of Russia, but more economically, and with the effect of sanctions and a potential regime change which could happen.
Long drawn out affair, so that's something that can be, read pretty clearly. Now, one of the things that you mentioned, when we were just having a chat offline before this interview started, is that the West has been providing Ukraine with a large amount of weapons. The large is disputed by many an analyst today, so I'm just going to say the West is providing them with weapons. The virality of these weapons and their age and their effectiveness has come into question by a lot of people within India, with abroad, and of course within Ukraine as well. That's point one. And point two, when you look back into history of the US actually distributing weapons in war zones, and those war zones, ultimately ending up in a sort of a anarchist sort of a situation. Do you foresee any sort of a problem happening in Ukraine? And of course, a comment of yours on the virality and the quantum of weapons coming in, sir.
Very, very interesting. In fact, very early in the war, if you do remember, I think we also discussed this, but I always kept saying that it's strange that the Russian military and the overall Russian strategy has looked at the aggression of the cities. They've looked at the blockade of the Black Sea. They've looked at territorial gains, perhaps up to the Dnieper River, etc. But they've apparently ignored the complete western flank of Ukraine, and that's the flank which actually borders NATO: Poland, Hungary, Moldova, and places like and countries like that. So this at that time was my observation too, and I felt that this is the route, this is the direction, cardinal direction from where all the supplies are going to subsequently come in. Not just supplies, but also all the sustenance for Ukraine will come in if this war elongates ultimately. So that's exactly what is happening. Now, as far as the weaponry which is coming in, the advantage that which is existing here is the fact that that equipment which has worked extremely well in operations, the Javelin missile, for example, the Stinger anti-aircraft missile, for example, the drones which have come in, all these things have already been tested out in battle and found to be very successful. So it's not that as if some ancient artillery pieces or some tanks are coming in and heavy equipment is coming in of that kind. It is lethal, technologically advanced equipment which is coming in, which the Russians don't have with them, and is creating a kind of an advantage, a tactical advantage on the battlefield for the Ukrainians. This had been realized early in the first 10, 15 days of the war itself. May I remind you, particularly, 1973, when Anwar Sadat took the Egyptian army across the Suez Canal, he went up to 10 kilometers, stopped, and that is the place where the screens of anti-tank weapons were put up by the Egyptian anti-tank gunners. And lots and lots of attacks of the Israelis took place, and the Israelis lost a lot of tanks. They were perturbed. They had no answer actually for the missiles which were right there in front of them, the Sagar missiles which were right in front of them at that time. The Americans took it upon themselves a massive airlift of TOW missiles. And TOW missiles had a range of 3,750 meters, which at that time was a huge thing. They came in, the Israelis immediately absorbed them, and in the middle of battles, to absorb fresh equipment of this kind, and then went into battle. If you ask me, the turnaround of 1973 took place very largely because of the huge American airlift with all this weaponry. This is something which is happening here too. Now, in this case, what is happening is that Europe, because of NATO, already has a huge stockpile of weaponry already here in different cities, different deployed areas, logistic bases, etc., all along the plains of Europe. All that is happening is that these are being lifted from there and brought closer to the countries which are bordering Ukraine, and from there they are being pushed out through convoys. Now, these are the convoys which could be very vulnerable today, but surprisingly, they are not. all these convoys, apparently, what reports I find in what I'm seeing from my research is that they're all moving at night, which is necessary. You can't move weapon-bearing convoys of this kind by day. But there don't seem to be any ground actions against them. There don't seem to be any special forces kind of operations against them. Initially, if you remember, the Russians tried hard. They landed in the Kiev airport also right at the beginning, but they couldn't hold on to it at that time. There are other airfields in the western part of Ukraine. Nothing has been done to put them down, any kind of air superiority for preventing the movement of all these convoys. Nothing has happened. So all this movement is having a field day, absolutely. And whether this can sustain the Ukrainian war effort is the question. You see, so far in the tactics that have been followed, the Ukrainians have been very successful with all this. And we've discussed it before that because the Russians have been very reluctant to bring in infantry and engage into infantry battles, etc., most of their equipment has suffered. And a large number of large-scale casualties, 15,000 dead. This is what we are hearing of Russian fatal casualties, which is a huge number. Obviously, the Russians are going to change something somewhere. I'm not sure how exactly, because at the moment, the East, we've just seen the beginning of operations in the East. We've been just hearing about the operations which are taking place in Donbass. There are only a few areas of engagement. It's primarily Mariupol. It's the Azov steel plant. These seem to be the places where the Russians have got stuck. But besides that, no major effort is going on. Obviously, something is in the making, and it will happen in the very near future. So it's the next battle which takes place may not happen necessarily in the same manner in which the operations took place north of Kharkiv or in the area of Kiev, etc. The Russians possibly, under pressure from the Russian leadership, could change these tactics. Whether they will bring in more infantry and follow more conventional kind of operations, that will be the moot point ultimately.
Interesting, sir. Before I move on to the next subject, I'd like you to also look at battlefield mathematics with regards to the weapon numbers which are coming into Ukraine and what they're being faced off with. Of course, we all know Russian firepower is something to be reckoned with. They've been hitting long-range weapons on Ukrainian train stations and all that, and this has just started yesterday. So for the past 3 months, they've just left everything be. Yesterday is the day that they've started doing some sort of action, and about 37 strikes is what the Russians claim. Your comments about the mathematics of the numbers between these two armies facing off with each other in the eastern part of Ukraine, sir.
I've done a little research on this. Let me see. I think I do have some figures, perhaps. For example, I mean, of the thing I can say that from a budgetary angle, the Ukrainian defense budget is about 5.9 or 6 billion odd dollars, right? And the Russians is about $62 billion. So that's 10 times the size, right? So obviously, over a period of time, the Russian army and Russian armed forces have built up to a greater strength. Their personnel strength is almost 900,000, and the Ukrainians about 210,000. Now, out of the 900,000, how much exactly have been brought into battle is not sure. I'm sure some of the troops who had been brought into Belarus to carry out the offensive operations against Kiev and Kharkiv and places like that, many of those troops have probably been swung around on the external axes towards the Donbass area. But a large size segment of those troops would still be there. Reason simply being, if I was a Ukrainian, I would be looking for opportunities to see the moment the Russians withdraw from the areas of Belarus, I would start my offensive from here. And can you imagine? That would be something which would really play merry hell into the Russian ranks. Can you imagine a kind of not exactly a counterattack, it would be like a riposte going into Belarus. But it may not happen immediately, but I do think that a large segment of the Russian forces are still there, more in a defensive mode. They are building up forces perhaps towards Donbass. Some of the forces have come from those which were engaged in the northern areas, but now those are in the east, and some more troops are probably building in, and that's perhaps where the delay is. When it comes to ratios, they are really not comparable in terms of equipment. For example, tanks. Let's just look at tanks. I think the Russians boast of 2,000 tanks. Oh, sorry, 12,000 tanks, and the Ukrainians boast of about 2,600 or tanks. Now, in the battles, a very large number of Russian tanks have been destroyed. 600 to 700 tanks have been probably destroyed. Replacements of that have probably come in, and that would have unnerved the cavaliers of the Russian army. Artillery, yes. Again, a preponderance with the Russians, 7,500 pieces as against about 2,000 pieces. And ammunition in the case of the Ukrainians would also be something which would be a challenge. Because moving up ammunition in the face of all that is happening, every day we are finding announcements of $54 million worth of equipment and ammunition which has been sanctioned by the United States, etc. Well, you may keep sanctioning any amount of money. It's ultimately a question of how the transportation is going to take place. And that is the challenge I just spoke about a few minutes ago. So all in all, if you really see, given the kind of destruction which has taken place in terms of both sides, I would say the ratio is very much in favor of the Russians. And you've seen it in the manner in which they've tackled some of the cities like Mariupol, etc. But the quality of the equipment, the quality of the new equipment which is particularly coming in, the drones, the missiles, the anti-aircraft and the anti-tank missiles, which have actually been force multipliers. These are going to play a major role in the next couple of phases which will probably take place. But what I fear is that the Russians are convinced that a huge amount of missilery, gunfire, which they're using to plaster the cities and the defenses, etc., is going to pay dividends. Now, this is something that we have to assess very correctly as the battle goes on, because the more and more this happens, the more cities get destroyed, national morale is going to really plummet as far as the Ukrainians are concerned. And one of the biggest challenges, which I'm sure we'll discuss just now, food shortages, fuel shortages. It's not just the war-fighting capability in terms of war-fighting equipment. It's all the support aspects of it. For example, the sowing season is coming in now.
Yeah.
And I'm told that Ukraine, the farmers cannot sow at the moment. They require a tremendous amount of diesel to ensure that they have water in their fields. So it is mechanized farming. A lot of power electricity is used. For that, you require generation. Everything is not nuclear. You do require generation of power. So this is not available. Why? For the simple reason that when a war breaks out, and this is something for people in India to realize also, that the moment a war breaks out, you're going to find rationing of fuel as far as your fuel pumps are concerned in your cities, because everything by priority is going to the armed forces. The aircraft are flying all over. Thousands of air vehicles are moving, and people should know that a single tank to even start in the early morning consumes a huge amount of fuel, right? So it's not something that is very positive to think about a war in these conditions. Extended wars of this kind can play havoc in the economics of a nation. That's exactly what is happening to Ukraine. Now, just as a matter of interest, 30% of the grain exports of the world are from Russia and Ukraine. And both countries are suffering. Both countries are suffering because of this. And this is going to cause a huge escalation in food prices around the world. Already, I'm told 20% food price escalation of food is something we can take for granted. It will happen in the very near future. Things like sunflower oil. Ukraine is 50% of the world's sunflower oil is being produced by them, right? 15% of global maize, and almost about 13 to 14% of barley of the world. So, huge number of food grains. It's like a grain basket of the world. Now, if the farmers are not going to get the resources to carry out their job, obviously they're going to suffer. The second aspect, oil cannot be brought in from anywhere. You see, the Black Sea is blockaded completely. It can only come in from the north. Earlier, it was coming from Belarus. I'm told now it can't come from Belarus, of course, so it will come from the West. I'm told that Poland is one country through which the very famous port of Dansk will, through that, some supplies will probably come in, but it will not be sufficient to overcome this problem. So economically, agriculturally, both things, I think Ukraine's sustainability is highly, highly questioned. And although the United States and NATO and everyone is playing very hard as far as information warfare is concerned into all our minds, I think any reasonable research shows you that at the moment the battlefield is very much in balance, primarily because of resource capability.
You mentioned about the shortages, and we will talk about that in due course. But one thing that fears me is the kind of weapons that are being put across within Ukraine, and it's the distribution controls. There was an article that was done in either, I think, the New York Times or the Washington Post, which talked about the US not being fully aware of where the weapons were being deployed and given to whom. So that's
this, Aadi, this is an inevitable problem of a conflict of this kind. This is Afghanistan, exactly. You remember when the United States withdrew on 15th of August to 31st of August, 650,000, right? 650,000 M4 rifles were left behind because these had been brought in to actually arm the police and the Afghan National Army and things like that. That's exactly what is happening here. In the rush to bring in everything, you bring in so much you just cannot. And how can you account for all this? Right? No one can really account for this in a situation such as this. Every single missile going and every single thing, launcher going. I remember in Kashmir many times facing this situation where intelligence would tell us that a possible Stinger missile has been infiltrated across the line of control by some of the foreign terrorists, etc. And everyone would go into a bit of a tizzy, and we would make sure that helicopters used to fly higher or lower, making sure that Stingers cannot sort of target them and things like that. So there are inevitable results of this. And the global war on terrorism, we don't hear about it because of what's happening in Ukraine, but there are issues going on in northern Afghanistan today, in Syria and places like that, where you may just find in the next 1 to 2, 3 years something new erupting here. And this is where all the weaponry is going to go. It happened in the case of Libya. From Libya, where a huge amount of weaponry was brought in by the United States, all that weaponry went into the arsenal of the ISIS in northern Syria because no one had any controls over it.
Absolutely. That's a very, very important point I think you've brought out, sir. So let's talk about what the US has said in the past sometime. There was, in the first month, it was, okay, Russia is doing a bad thing, it's an aggressor, it's oppressing people, this, that, and all that. But there were no, we encouraged negotiations, we encouraged diplomacy was being also said. Now it is outright defeat of Russia is what is being called for. And Lloyd Austin actually, during his visit to Kiev, actually mentioned the factor that we would like to weaken Russia. Now, what do you analyze of this target that the West
this is very interesting. It's very interesting. And so far, you see, most of the assessments that we have been making in India have been based on Western inputs. This is something that we have to admit because it's been a one-sided information war, all emanating primarily from the Western media, sources of that kind and things like that. We really don't know Russia's actual war-fighting capability today, the balanced capability today. And it could be something very different to what we are assessing. But it seems that NATO, the West in general, seems to be quite confident. And their intelligence inputs seem to be probably indicating to them that things are not too good on ground, and therefore there's no point in negotiating at this end. The Ukrainian president has made it very clear that he is not going to negotiate unless the Russians first agree, of course, a ceasefire, and then agree to withdraw from their territories. Right? He's not willing to give Donbass or anything, allowing the Russians to rest on the Dnieper River, etc., things which we had assessed a couple of weeks ago, that this could be potential situations which could bring about a ceasefire. That seems to be something of the past now. The Ukrainians are hell-bent that territorially, every bit of territory has to be restored to Ukraine. Now, earlier there was a lot of talk about not joining NATO. None of that talk is today being made, right? In fact, one or two instances here and there, people have spoken that the Ukraine could very well remain on the NATO sort of scan everywhere. So this confidence seems to be coming out, obviously, from the tactical victories which have taken place. I don't say any strategic victory has taken place at all anywhere so far. We are still in the should I say, the dogfight stage, the war fighting dogfight stage, which is still going on. The outcomes will be decided in many months from now. But as I said earlier, the intelligence reports with the Americans, NATO, European allies, etc., seem to indicate that 2-3 things could happen. One, regime change could take place in Moscow, which is what they'll probably be working on very, very avidly, because they think they can create internal dissensions within the Russian leadership. It's happened in the past. That, if you remember, even someone like Khrushchev was brought down in this manner. An ultimatum was given to him. Ultimately, an internal palace coup took place, and then Brezhnev and Kosygin and everyone came to power at that particular time. So it's not something something which is unknown in Russia as such. That kind of a pressure can be built up. And how is that pressure built up? Socially, right? Socially, perhaps an information game is already going on. Lots of messaging going on to the public. How it is taking place exactly, we do not know, because we don't have access to that kind of social media handles, etc. Much of it may be in Russian. It would be taking place from some parts of Eastern Europe itself. I'm not very certain how it's happening, but I'm sure some kind of a sustained campaign of information to reach out to the public and tell them that this is a losing game for Russia. This is probably going on at the moment. The second thing is to convince the leadership, the military leadership, that military victory is for them something which they should not even imagine. Now, how do you do that exactly? By ensuring resilience on the ground, confidence building of the Ukrainian strategic leadership, the Ukrainian public itself, and ensuring that the kind of thing we are talking about, economics, sustainability of the Ukrainian economy and its capability to sustain this war for long, all this is given enough publicity in the public eye, so that overall Ukraine does think that it can actually win this war, right? So it's because of all this that is happening. No, you are not talking about negotiations. You're not talking about ceasefires at the moment. Let's see what happens once the sowing season is over. I don't know how much Ukraine is going to suffer from that, right? How Russia is affected internally also by all that we are saying. A 16% drop in GDP is not something easy to absorb. Remember, India absorbed minus 24% in the first year of the pandemic. We bounced back. I mean, you've got to give credit to ourselves. We have bounced back, and we are looking at a 7.5%, 8% GDP growth today. Here is a decline of 16%, 12 to 16%, which is being looked at the moment. What will be the effect? Can this bounce back take place at all? Can energy sector become something with which Russia can play it out as such, with huge efforts going on to make sure that Europe is divested of its dependence of energy on Russia? You may find a very, very different picture emerging. So this is some of the reasons primarily for which this confidence is noticeable in the NATO and the Western ranks.
That's one of the biggest doubts, when they see a mighty army in front of a small little force.
Exactly.
Work. So you spoke about the Russian economy, and obviously any war will take a beating to any economy. Maybe even the US economy, it's going to have its effects back home. what we see right now is two types of war. One is the conventional on-ground battle, which is taking place army to army. There's another big war which is happening, which we haven't spoken about before, which is the economic war. The war of sanctions. I think the Russians today put out a report in the Pravda, which they were talking about. They're counting the number of sanctions. I think it was a snarky comment on the West.
6,900, I'm told. 6,900 is the fresh figure of the new restrictions. Right? Earlier sanctions were already there, which have taken place since a long time now. But now 6,900 new since the start of the war. That's the kind of thing.
Fair enough. So you told us the effect of these sanctions on the Russians. I'm sure you'll be able to tell us a little more about that within this answer. I'd also like to ask you the effect on the sanctions of the other side. So these are not, sanctions are coming out to be two-sided weapons. You know, it's kind of hurting the EU as well. How do you see this entire game being played out today, sir?
Yes, you are absolutely right. Let's first look at the Russian side, and I'll repeat some of the figures which I have said earlier. I just said 6,900 new restrictions have been placed on Russia ever since the beginning of the war. The Russian economy estimated to contract by 12.5 to 16%, something like to that too. And the industrial production will contract, has already contracted by about 16.5%, that's minus, and could end up contracting as much as 20 to 22% by the end of this year. Investments, inward investments which have been coming up are likely to get reduced by 30 to 40%, which is a fair amount. And as I said, trade balance goes up 40%, not in favor of Russia, which means the difference between imports and exports, it'll be adverse in the favor of, in the case of Russia. So this is all having a severe effect, there's no doubt about it. But what is important is also that my research showed me that a lot of researchers internationally, economists, etc., have said that Russia has weathered this kind of a storm in the past. It did it in 2014, it did it in 2008, but of course the magnitude may not have been that much at that time. The kind of sanctions which were there were not of that kind. 2008, of course, were not sanctions. 2008 were more the adverse effects of the subprime crisis which happened in the United States. So if you are going to do a war effort, obviously the Russians have to have a focus in Ukraine. It's not that this Ukraine is a walkover. They've realized it themselves. They have to go in for more production. They have to go in for, they have to divert much of their fuel reserves, etc. Here, I'm told they're already having some bit of a problem as far as their exports are concerned. Their energy exports are concerned. Of course, Europe, there's a different equation as far as Europe is concerned. Germany is likely to dry itself up completely as far as Russian imports are concerned, energy imports are concerned. But we know that despite the war, Europe has continued to receive supplies of Russian energy for most of the winter period as such. But efforts are being looked at to see how this can be sustained from different other sources. It could be Iran tomorrow, it could be Saudi Arabia, etc. It depends a lot on the cooperation of OPEC itself, whether they would want to enhance their output, because enhancement of output means immediately the dropping of prices. And this is something which the West is looking for. Dropping of prices means the Russian coffers don't get that kind of income as they are getting currently, or they were getting just before the war. So with all this, my assessment seems to indicate that Russia can still fight. It can fight. Its industrial production reduces in different other fields here and there. Yes, its exports come down tremendously. Its income comes down overall. There will be a lot of effect in the rural areas. There will be a lot of effect in terms of food availability, fuel availability, and things of that kind. Foreign exchange reserves are likely to get affected because of the equation with the dollar, which is changing very, very rapidly. So with all this, Russia has to tighten its belt. Just like any nation involved in war fighting for a sustained period has to tighten its belt. it's not that the Russians can just wilt like that. It's a nation, it's a large nation, after all, we got to remember. It's a nation with a fairly big economy, right? And it has a history. If you remember, 28 million people died in the Second World War, right? The Russian armed forces lost something to the tune of 7 to 8 million people. Now, a nation which has got a history of this kind doesn't wilt so easily. I'm not sure whether I'm sure a lot of American historians are at the moment studying this in various think tanks, in departments and universities all over America. That's what America is really good at, this intellectual analysis, so important. They must be all looking at deep into figures to see how did Russia sustain itself during the Cold War? How did it sustain itself in the last couple of years after the sanctions were brought in? And what is the future sustainability in the face of this downturn in its economy? I'm sure they'll come out with figures to say 1 to 2 to 3 years, perhaps Russia can last out and continue fighting a low-grade kind of a war, right? Now, that is exactly what the Americans are looking for, right? A reduction in overall hostilities, etc. And that is what is going to give a boost to Ukraine. The lesser amount of hostilities on the Eastern Front, obviously the NATO with all its power can make sure that Ukraine is sustained, given a push, given its capability, more weaponry, etc. It's a question of national confidence. So we are in a very interesting situation where it's not just about war fighting itself. It's so much more to do with economics, logistics, will to fight, leadership, all these things which are, issues which are non-quantifiable in many ways, which contribute tremendously to the outcome of war.
The intangibles, I think, which is
exactly
playing out in this entire battlefield. And it's interesting that you mentioned, the Russian strength to strive on, because there was a couple of news a couple of days ago where the Russian ruble has actually strengthened because of certain reasons. Probably they've got their investments out from somewhere or whatever it was. But there was also an analysis which was done on this aspect that these are periodical rise because the Russian are not importing as much right now during this past 2 months. So they've got certain amount of money collected up. So it's a temporary sort of a period, which
temporary kind of a situation. Yes, exactly. I read about this.
Could be sustained for a little bit. So now I'm going to ask you something which for me is the saddest part about this war is what's happening in Ukraine. The West is pumping in money, weapons. The Russians are on their doorstep, and of course, there's also a whole lot of internal political dynamics. The Ukrainians are not. It's not a simple society. We know the divisions within the society. We know the nationalist extremists, as a lot of them call them. We know the left also exists there in a large number. Now, when a war like this actually goes on, and when the Russians start targeting infrastructure, the people needs are being hit. You mentioned about fuel shortages, food shortages. The question is, how long will a country like that sustain itself? And wouldn't Ukraine end up becoming a sort of a desert by the end of this?
Well, for one, yes, it's a very interesting question that we are discussing. Ukrainian cities have suffered tremendously. The Ukrainian population has suffered. A very large segment. Quantifiable figures, not very reliable yet, as to how many exactly are displaced people in terms of who have moved out from Ukraine into the western side. UNHCR figures I'm not fully aware of at the moment, but it's a fairly large segment of people who have obviously got displaced. This happened in Syria also, if you remember. Large segments of the cities were destroyed, and large 4 to 5 million people out of a 24 million population emigrated into Europe via the Turkey route and things like that. All that happened here. Here is a population of 44, 45 million people, and a reasonably much better developed country which has been devastated. They're saying that it will cost anything to the tune of $600 to $700 billion to restore to the status quo as to what it was, status quo ante as such, to what the status it was on 24th of February when this war broke out. But having said all this, the fact that entire NATO is backing it, right? And the whole of Europe is backing it. And there are countries, of course, many countries around the world, which are not backing it in this particular manner. India, for example, is calling for a ceasefire, calling for an end to hostilities, and our attitude has been very, very correct so far. But when you've got the might of the European Union behind you, Germany, a $3 trillion economy, the UK and France, both about $2 to $2.5 trillion economies, the United States with its riches of 21, 22, $23 trillion economy. With that kind of a thing, you're comparing it to Russia and the backing of China. China doesn't give any free lunches in that particular way. But the Russians have to sustain against the economic might of the West. And I'm reminded of the Cold War, which ended not because of any military reasons, primarily, but because of economic reasons at the end of it, right? So I'm sure with all these visits going on to Kiev, with Zelensky himself coming out and speaking in Warsaw and places like that, there's a sustained psychological campaign on to make sure that the Ukraine front remains intact, although no one is going to pump troops in here to fight. They will just continue to push in weaponry, money, etc. How long can this go on? That is the question. Can the Ukrainian population have that kind of a stamina to last out? It's a generation which is getting wiped out completely here. This is exactly what happened to France, and if you remember, in the First World War. There's a whole generation which is getting wiped out here. It can go on for a year, go on for 2 years perhaps. But beyond that, there are no studies at the moment to tell us figures of that kind. But I think resilience at some stage, human resilience does start caving in. And that's the time when even Zelensky at the moment, gung-ho with his supposed tactical, some strategic successes here and there, could start wilting, to start coming under tremendous pressure. Does the West have alternatives in terms of leadership? So far, no face is visible anyway. I'm sure the West and NATO is looking at this alternatives. If they're really into this kind of game seriously, they must look at a couple of alternatives. Because Zelensky may just, for all you know, he may be bumped off tomorrow by the Russians. So this kind of a thing you have to be careful about. So all these factors are playing into it. This is an end game that we are looking at, which doesn't seem to be having any, at the end of the tunnel, doesn't seem to be having any light. But a couple of more, it gives us scope to have a couple of more of our discussions before finally something really emerges at the end.
Absolutely, sir. A final word, closing comment, sir. We forgot Afghanistan after, first of all, let me just rewind a little bit. COVID was the biggest thing. China became the flavor of the season. Everybody started looking inwards. Afghanistan happened. Everybody started looking towards Afghanistan. Hey, this, that, all that stuff. Now we've forgotten Afghanistan because Ukraine has happened. I'd like to ask you, sir, what if something else happened and people forget Ukraine?
You see, I still say that the 3 or 4 major things which have happened in the last 2 years, which are changing the whole gamut of international geopolitics.
That's what, yes.
It starts with the pandemic, the effects of the pandemic, economic effects of the pandemic, the downturn in economies around the world. It has a huge, huge effect. Second thing, which I do not discount, this standoff in Eastern Ladakh, as Indians, we cannot ignore it.
Yeah, of course.
April 2020, it happened. It's still continuing. We've still got that same amount of troops sitting on top there, despite maybe some agreements that we have had to pull back from certain areas. But we've had 13 or 14, I'm not sure, I've lost count, 14 rounds of talks between the corps commanders. there, which is not leading to anything. And so that standoff continues very much there. And then the Afghanistan conflict, the end of the Afghanistan conflict, and the withdrawal of the United States, leaving behind a fair amount of turbulence, the problems still taking place in northern Afghanistan at the moment, which are out of focus primarily because of what's happening in Ukraine, and then the outbreak of the Ukraine. Now, there's one area, if you notice, or rather two areas, which are relatively quiet at the moment. The Middle East has been reasonably quiet, except for the little bit of an upsurge that you had on the Palestinian-Israeli front. Otherwise, by and large, it has been quiet.
Yes.
The Indo-Pacific has been very, very quiet, right? We have not had too much of gunboat diplomacy going on by the Chinese, etc. Of course, it is not reported so much, but there are things going on there at all times. There are pinpricks at all times which are taking place. Politics in the Indo-Pacific are going up in a very big way. The Chinese have effort to try and seek influence in the South Pacific Islands, the Solomon Islands, for example. Yes. A very, very interesting issue, delving deeper into the South Pacific to look around Australia and places like that. So lots of interesting things are happening outside the gaze of Ukraine, right? I would say a major event could possibly take place in the Middle East, although the chances of it seem to be low at the particular moment. Nothing very much is likely to happen in South Asia at the moment, because given Pakistan strategic lead, Pakistan political leadership, etc., and the state of the Pakistan economy, the India-China factor, given what has happened in Ukraine, I'm not sure that Chinese would like to risk something at this stage, right? With the pandemic also inside China, and the outcomes of this war in Ukraine still very, very uncertain. I'm sure that Chinese would not want to play their cards at this stage, either in Taiwan or against India. Mm-hmm. So at this moment, whatever happens, whatever big happens, if at all it happens, will be a strategic surprise to the world, right? Well, you can't ever discount things like 9/11 have happened, etc. But there is no build-up to something like that which is happening at the current moment. For us in India, it's very interesting. We must not lose sight of this fact. A very interesting visit has taken place by Prime Minister Narendra Modi to Europe. It's after the efforts which are going on and the kind of position India is finding itself in among the middle powers, such as the UK, Germany, France. Three important countries with which we have dealt extensively in the recent past. These are very interesting issues which are coming up at the moment. And despite the fact that we have not taken the Western side, we have not taken the American and NATO side as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned. So we are coming in for some very interesting times and a lot of scope for us to continue our strategic discussions.
That's one thing I realize, foreign affairs and strategic discussions, do not get affected by pandemics and this and that in terms of regularity of their or continuation of their effort. Rest, everything stops. So all you need is a laptop, a mic, and an internet connection, and you're on.
Yes.
Sir, absolutely. This has been an insightful discussion, although, we've gone across a couple of different places here and there, but I think my idea was to do exactly that, to cover the war from various different angles. We spoke about from the Russian angle, from the Ukrainian angle, from the Western angle. EU angle as well is something that you had brought out. And of course, my biggest fear is that, about the country of Ukraine. I'm not talking about the politics of Ukraine. It's just that the entire country will be left to be a rump state in the middle of two great powers fighting each other till the last drop of blood drops down on the floor. And that's what is devastating of this entire thing. That these kind of conventional conflicts where mass casualties and this and that, something I don't think anybody had dreamt would happen in this day and age today, sir.
Absolutely. You're right. Aadi, and I only worry a little bit about the nuclear aspect. Because I'm convinced it will not happen.
True.
But people in power can act very awkwardly sometimes, especially when they're going down. And that is something that we have to be very fearful about. If that happens, this is going to be catastrophic as far as the world is concerned.
Let's hope and pray that doesn't, sir. Even what is happening right now is causing enough damage to the world. And I say this, I've said this very often. I want the war to stop because it's affecting my pocket. It's affecting my payouts every month. It's affecting my fuel bills. And let me be a little more selfish in saying this. I want this war to stop.
Stop. Absolutely. All of us want this war to stop.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That is what it is, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Till next time for another interesting discussion on another geopolitical aspect which affects all of us around the world. Jai Hind.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and Jai Hind.